This court does not allow the display of medals, sir.
Judge, this is the Purple Heart I received for my service in Vietnam.
I don't care what it is. Take it off.
Judge orders veteran to take off medal. What happens next destroys his career. Walter Freeman thought jury duty would be routine, just another civic obligation for the 62-year-old Army veteran. But when Judge Richard Barrett spotted the Purple Heart on Walter's lapel and ordered him to remove what he called a distracting trinket, the decorated black veteran faced an impossible choice. What happened next would expose a judge's shocking prejudice, ignite a national movement, and prove that some battles for dignity are worth fighting regardless of the cost. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Henrico County Courthouse as Walter Freeman adjusted his tie and checked his watch. At 62, he moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had absorbed decades of military discipline, though the slight limp in his left leg spoke to sacrifices made in distant places for causes larger than himself. Walter wore his best suit for jury duty, a navy blue ensemble that his late wife Margaret had helped him pick out for their grandson's graduation 3 years ago. On his left lapel, positioned with military precision, was a small purple ribbon topped with a bronze heart bearing the profile of George Washington. The Purple Heart medal was modest in size, but immense in meaning, representing wounds received in service to his country during 2 tours in Vietnam. The courthouse buzzed with the typical energy of a Monday morning, lawyers shuffling papers, clerks calling cases, and dozens of potential jurors like Walter filing into the assembly room. He'd been called for jury duty twice before, but had never been selected. Today felt different, though he couldn't quite say why. Judge Richard Barrett presided over courtroom 3A with the imperious bearing of someone who'd grown accustomed to absolute authority over his domain. At 58, Barrett was a third-generation judge whose family name adorned buildings throughout the county. He'd built his reputation on strict courtroom decorum and zero tolerance for what he considered disruptions to the dignity of his court. Barrett's eyes swept over the jury pool with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to reading people quickly. His attention lingered on Walter, taking in the veteran's bearing, his careful grooming, and most notably, the small medal on his lapel that caught the courtroom's fluorescent lighting. Ladies and gentlemen, Barrett began, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades on the bench. This court demands the highest standards of behavior and appearance. We will not tolerate any displays, decorations, or accessories that might influence or distract from the proceedings. Walter shifted slightly in his seat, his hand unconsciously moving toward his Purple Heart. He'd worn the medal to formal occasions for 40 years, never thinking it might be considered inappropriate. It was part of who he was, a visible reminder of service and sacrifice that had shaped his entire adult life. Before we begin jury selection, Barrett continued, his eyes now fixed directly on Walter, I need to address a matter of courtroom decorum. The words hung in the air like a gathering storm, and Walter felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came when he sensed trouble approaching. Sir, Judge Barrett said, pointing directly at Walter, the gentleman in the 3rd row. Please stand. Walter rose slowly, feeling the eyes of 60 potential jurors turning toward him. The courtroom fell silent, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic outside. I can see you're wearing some sort of decoration on your jacket. Barrett continued, his tone carrying the dismissive authority of someone unaccustomed to being questioned. This court does not permit displays of political affiliations, organizational memberships, or personal accessories that might influence the proceedings. Walter's voice was steady when he replied, "Your Honor, this is a Purple Heart Medal. I earned it serving in Vietnam." "I don't care what it is." Barrett snapped, his patience already wearing thin. "Remove it immediately." The words hit Walter like a physical blow. In 40 years of wearing his Purple Heart to formal occasions, no one had ever asked him to remove it. Not at graduations, weddings, funerals, or civic events. The medal represented the worst and best day of his life, the day he'd been wounded, pulling 3 fellow soldiers from a burning helicopter, and the day he'd learned that service sometimes required sacrifices that couldn't be measured in paychecks or promotions. "Your Honor," Walter said carefully, "this medal represents wounds received in service to our country. It's not a political statement or personal accessory." Barrett's face flushed with anger. "Sir, I am the authority in this courtroom. When I give an order, you follow it. Remove that trinket immediately or face contempt of court." The word trinket sent a ripple of shock through the courtroom. Several veterans in the jury pool straightened in their seats, recognizing the Purple Heart and understanding the magnitude of Barrett's disrespect. A few potential jurors exchanged uncomfortable glances, sensing that something significant was happening. Walter felt 40 years of suppressed anger rising in his chest, anger at being dismissed, at having his service minimized, at being treated like a child who needed to be corrected. But he also felt something else, the quiet strength that had carried him through 2 tours in Vietnam and 4 decades of civilian life as one of the few black veterans in his community. "Your Honor," Walter said, his voice growing stronger, "I respectfully decline to remove my Purple Heart Medal." The silence that followed was deafening. In 20 years on the bench, Judge Barrett had never been directly defied by a potential juror. His authority was absolute within these walls, and Walter's refusal represented a challenge that couldn't be ignored. "Bailiff," Barrett commanded, his voice tight with rage, "arrest this man for contempt of court." As the bailiff approached, Walter remained standing, his hands at his sides, his bearing still reflecting the military discipline that had shaped his character. He thought about Margaret, who had always been proud of his service, and about his grandson Marcus, who wore Walter's old dog tags as a reminder of the grandfather who'd served his country with honor. "Your Honor," called out a voice from the jury pool. It was James Rodriguez, a Marine veteran who'd served in Iraq. "That man is wearing a Purple Heart. He was wounded in service to this country." "And I'm a Navy veteran," added another voice. "That medal represents sacrifice that deserves respect, not contempt." More voices joined in, veterans identifying themselves, civilians expressing support, and a growing chorus of people who understood that something fundamentally wrong was happening in courtroom 3A. Barrett pounded his gavel repeatedly, his face now red with fury. "Order! I will have order in this court." But the damage was done. Walter Freeman's quiet act of defiance had exposed something ugly in Judge Barrett's character, and the courtroom full of witnesses would ensure that this moment wouldn't be forgotten or covered up. The arrest of Walter Freeman for contempt of court made local news within hours. But it was the cell phone video recorded by a potential juror that turned a local incident into a national story. The footage showed Walter standing with quiet dignity as Judge Barrett called his Purple Heart a trinket and ordered his arrest for refusing to remove it. Within 24 hours, the video had been viewed millions of times across social media platforms. Veterans organizations, civil rights groups, and military families shared the footage with outrage and disbelief. The hashtag, Respect the Heart, began trending, accompanied by photos of Purple Heart recipients and stories of their sacrifices. Walter spent the night in county jail, his first time behind bars in 62 years of life. He sat on the narrow bunk, still wearing his suit, minus the tie and belt that had been confiscated, and thought about the chain of events that had led him here. He'd simply wanted to serve on a jury to fulfill his civic duty as he'd done throughout his adult life. The next morning brought a parade of visitors to the jail. First came his daughter Patricia, a nurse who'd driven 3 hours from Richmond after seeing the news. She was followed by reporters, veterans advocates, and lawyers offering to represent him pro bono. Dad, Patricia, said, tears in her eyes as they sat across from each other in the visiting room, "The whole country is talking about what you did. People are calling you a hero." Walter shook his head. "I'm not a hero, Patricia. I just couldn't let him disrespect what that medal represents." "That's exactly why you are a hero," she replied. Meanwhile, Judge Barrett was discovering that his absolute authority within the courtroom didn't extend to the court of public opinion. His office was flooded with calls demanding his resignation. Protesters had gathered outside the courthouse, many of them veterans wearing their own medals and decorations. Local news crews had set up permanent positions across the street. The Virginia State Bar Association announced an investigation into Barrett's conduct. The Judicial Inquiry and Review Commission opened formal proceedings. Most damaging of all other stories began to emerge accounts from attorneys and court personnel about Barrett's pattern of disrespectful treatment toward veterans, minorities, and anyone he perceived as beneath his station. Walter's arraignment drew a packed courtroom with veterans in dress uniforms filling the gallery. When he entered wearing his suit with the Purple Heart prominently displayed, the entire gallery stood in silent salute. Judge Barrett notably was not presiding. He'd been temporarily reassigned pending the investigation. The new judge, the Honorable Maria Santos, was a former military prosecutor who understood the significance of military decorations. She looked at Walter with respect as she addressed the contempt charges. "Mr. Freeman," Judge Santos said, "I've reviewed the circumstances of your arrest. While respect for judicial authority is paramount in our system, the court also recognizes that your Purple Heart Medal represents service and sacrifice that deserves honor, not contempt." She dismissed the charges, but Walter's legal troubles were far from over. Judge Barrett, using his political connections and family influence, had filed additional charges disrupting court proceedings, inciting a riot, and even suggested that Walter's military records should be investigated for fraud. "He's trying to destroy me," Walter told his newly assigned attorney, Sarah Chen, a former JAG officer who'd volunteered to represent him. "He's questioning my service, my character, everything I've stood for." "He's scared," Chen replied. "The investigation into his conduct is revealing a pattern of abuse that goes back years. Your case was just the catalyst that brought it all to light." The evidence against Barrett was mounting. Court transcripts showed a pattern of discriminatory behavior. Former clerks came forward with stories of racist comments and inappropriate conduct. Most damaging was the discovery that Barrett had a history of targeting veterans in his courtroom, often making disparaging comments about military service and dismissing the significance of military decorations. The story took another turn when Marcus Freeman Walter's grandson posted a video on social media. The 18-year-old college student wore his grandfather's old dog tags as he spoke directly to the camera. "My grandfather served 2 tours in Vietnam," Marcus said, his voice strong despite his youth. "He was wounded, saving other soldiers' lives. He came home to a country that didn't always appreciate his service, but he never complained. He raised a family, worked hard, and served his community. And now some judge wants to call his Purple Heart a trinket." The video went viral, adding a generational dimension to the story. Young people who'd never heard of the Purple Heart were learning about military sacrifice. Veterans were sharing their own stories of discrimination and disrespect. The conversation had grown beyond Walter's individual case to encompass broader questions about how society treats its veterans. Walter found himself at the center of a movement he'd never intended to start. Speaking requests poured in from veterans organizations, civil rights groups, and military academies. Publishers wanted him to write a book. Documentary filmmakers sought interviews. But Walter remained focused on the simple principle that had started it all: respect for service and sacrifice. He would use whatever platform he'd been given to ensure that no other veteran would face the humiliation he'd endured in Judge Barrett's courtroom. 3 weeks after the initial confrontation, Judge Barrett launched a vicious counterattack that threatened to destroy Walter's reputation and everything he'd worked to build. Using his extensive political connections and family influence, Barrett orchestrated a campaign designed to discredit Walter's military service and paint him as a fraud seeking attention and financial gain. The attack began with an anonymous tip to a right-wing blog questioning the authenticity of Walter's Purple Heart. The blog post, clearly written with inside information, suggested that Walter's military records contained discrepancies and that his wounds might not have been sustained in combat. Within hours, the story had been picked up by national media outlets, and Walter found himself defending not just his actions in the courtroom, but his entire military service. "They're saying I made it all up," Walter told his attorney, Sarah Chen, his voice heavy with exhaustion and pain. 40 years of wearing this medal with pride, and now they're calling me a liar." The attacks escalated when Barrett's allies in the prosecutor's office announced they were reopening the case against Walter, this time with additional charges of fraud and perjury. They claimed that Walter had misrepresented his military service to gain sympathy and avoid prosecution for contempt of court. The psychological toll was devastating. Walter, who had endured combat in Vietnam and decades of subtle discrimination in civilian life, found himself breaking under the weight of having his most sacred memories questioned. He stopped sleeping, barely ate, and withdrew from the media attention that had initially supported him. The crisis deepened when someone leaked Walter's home address, leading to harassment that forced him to move in with his daughter Patricia. Protesters appeared outside her house, some supporting Walter, but others carrying signs questioning his honesty and patriotism. The stress caused Patricia to take leave from her nursing job to care for her father. "Maybe I should just give up," Walter told Patricia one evening as they watched news coverage that portrayed him as either a hero or a fraud with no middle ground. "Maybe I should have just taken off the medal and avoided all this." "Dad, Patricia said firmly, "You did the right thing. Don't let them make you doubt that." But the doubt was growing not just in Walter's mind, but in public opinion. Barrett's campaign was working polls showed that support for Walter was declining as questions about his military service gained traction. Veterans organizations that had initially rallied to his cause began distancing themselves, unwilling to risk their credibility on someone whose service was being questioned. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Master Sergeant James Mitchell, who had served with Walter in Vietnam, saw the news coverage and contacted Sarah Chen with documentation that would change everything. "I've been following this story," Mitchell told Chen during a phone call from his home in Texas. "Walter Freeman saved my life in 1969, and I have the paperwork to prove it." Mitchell had kept detailed records of their unit's activities, including after-action reports, medical records, and photographs that documented Walter's heroism. More importantly, he had the original citation for Walter's Purple Heart, signed by their commanding officer and witnessed by multiple soldiers. "Walter pulled me and 2 other guys out of a burning helicopter after we took an RPG hit," Mitchell explained. "He was wounded by shrapnel in the process, but he kept going back until everyone was out. The man's a genuine hero, and anyone saying otherwise is a damn liar." Chen immediately flew to Texas to collect Mitchell's documentation, but she also discovered something else. Barrett's family had a history of opposing integration and civil rights. Barrett's grandfather had been a prominent segregationist, and Barrett himself had been involved in efforts to remove Confederate monuments from courthouse grounds, not to promote racial healing, but to preserve what he called historical heritage. The revelation that Barrett's attack on Walter might be motivated by racial prejudice as well as judicial arrogance added another dimension to the story. Civil rights organizations that had been watching from the sidelines now threw their full support behind Walter. But Barrett wasn't finished. Using his influence with the State Bar Association, he filed a complaint against Sarah Chen, alleging that she had engaged in unethical conduct by publicizing the case and encouraging media attention. The complaint threatened Chen's law license and her ability to continue representing Walter. "He's trying to isolate you," Chen told Walter during what might be their final meeting as attorney and client. "If he can get me disbarred, you'll have to find new representation, and most lawyers won't want to take on a case this controversial." Walter looked at the woman who had fought for him when others wouldn't and made a decision that would define the final phase of his battle with Judge Barrett. "Then we better make sure we win before that happens." The turning point came when Congressman David Williams, a former Marine and chairman of the House Veterans Affairs Committee, announced that he was launching a congressional investigation into Walter's case and the broader issue of discrimination against veterans in the judicial system. What happened to Walter Freeman represents a systemic failure to respect the service and sacrifice of our nation's veterans. Williams declared at a press conference surrounded by Purple Heart recipients from multiple conflicts, "We will not allow judicial prejudice to go unchecked." The congressional hearing was scheduled for the same week as Barrett's disciplinary hearing before the Judicial Inquiry and Review Commission. Walter found himself preparing for 2 of the most important days of his life, knowing that the outcome would determine not just his own fate, but the precedent for how veterans would be treated in courtrooms across the country. Sarah Chen had assembled a legal team that included military law experts, civil rights attorneys, and veterans advocates. They had documentation proving Walter's service witness testimony from his fellow soldiers and evidence of Barrett's pattern of discriminatory behavior, but Barrett had resources too. His family's political connections reached into the highest levels of state government. He had hired one of the most expensive law firms in Virginia, and they were arguing that Walter's case was being blown out of proportion by media attention and political opportunism. This is about judicial authority. Barrett's lead attorney argued during pre-hearing motions. If judges cannot maintain order in their courtrooms without being subjected to national media campaigns, then the entire judicial system is at risk. The night before the congressional hearing, Walter sat in his hotel room in Washington, D.C., looking at the Purple Heart that had started everything. He thought about the helicopter crash in Vietnam, about the soldiers he'd saved, about Margaret's pride when he'd first shown her the medal, and about the principle that had brought him to this moment. His phone rang. It was Master Sergeant Mitchell calling from Texas. "Walter, I wanted you to know that 37 guys from our old unit are driving to D.C. tomorrow. We're going to be there when you testify." Walter felt tears in his eyes. "James, you don't have to." "Yes, we do. You saved our lives then, and now it's our turn to save yours." The congressional hearing room was packed beyond capacity. Veterans filled the gallery, many wearing their dress uniforms and medals. Media from around the world had gathered to cover what had become a defining moment in the conversation about respect for military service. Walter took his seat at the witness table wearing his best suit, with the Purple Heart prominently displayed. Beside him sat Sarah Chen, and behind him the 37 members of his old unit who had traveled from across the country to support him. Congressman Williams called the hearing to order and began with a statement that set the tone for everything that followed. "Mr. Freeman, you are here today, not as a defendant or a person seeking sympathy, but as a representative of every veteran who has faced discrimination, disrespect, or dismissal of their service. Your courage in standing up to judicial prejudice has sparked a national conversation that was long overdue." Walter's testimony was simple and powerful. He spoke about his service in Vietnam, about the day he earned his Purple Heart, and about the pride he'd felt wearing it for 40 years. He talked about Judge Barrett's order to remove what he called a trinket, and about the principle that had led him to refuse. "I didn't set out to become a symbol or start a movement," Walter said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed hearing room. "I just couldn't let someone disrespect what that medal represents, not just my service, but the service of every veteran who has worn the uniform and made sacrifices for this country." The most dramatic moment came when Barrett himself was called to testify. Under oath and facing potential perjury charges, he was forced to admit that he had called Walter's Purple Heart a trinket and had ordered its removal without any legal justification. "I maintain that courtroom decorum requires," Barrett began, but Congressman Williams cut him off. "Judge Barrett, is it your position that a Purple Heart medal earned through wounds received in combat service to the United States is equivalent to a political button or personal accessory?" Barrett's pause was telling. The court requires appropriate attire." "That's not what I asked. Is a Purple Heart a trinket?" "No." Barrett finally admitted, his voice barely audible. The hearing concluded with testimony from constitutional law experts who explained that Barrett's order had violated both Walter's First Amendment rights and federal laws protecting veterans from discrimination. The committee voted unanimously to recommend that the Justice Department investigate Barrett for civil rights violations. But the real climax came during Barrett's disciplinary hearing the following day. The Judicial Inquiry and Review Commission had heard testimony from dozens of witnesses about Barrett's pattern of discriminatory behavior. The evidence was overwhelming. Barrett had systematically targeted veterans, minorities, and anyone he perceived as challenging his authority. When the commission announced its decision, Barrett's career was effectively over. He was removed from the bench, stripped of his judicial pension, and referred to the state bar for potential disbarment. The commission's report specifically cited his treatment of Walter Freeman as conduct unbecoming a judicial officer and incompatible with the dignity of the judiciary. Walter watched from the gallery as Barrett was escorted from the courthouse for the final time. There was no satisfaction in the moment, only a sense that justice had finally been served. Outside the courthouse, surrounded by veterans and supporters, Walter spoke to the assembled media. "This was never about me," he said. "This was about ensuring that every veteran, every person who has served this country, is treated with the respect and dignity they've earned. Today, we've taken a step toward making sure that happens." The Freeman Respect Act, introduced in Congress the following week, would codify protections for veterans against judicial discrimination and establish clear guidelines for the treatment of military decorations in courtrooms. Walter Freeman had won more than a personal victory, he had changed the system itself. 1 year later, Walter Freeman stood in the Rose Garden of the White House as President Martinez signed the Freeman Respect Act into law. The legislation, passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, established federal protections for veterans against discrimination in judicial proceedings and mandated training for judges on military service and decorations. This law ensures that no veteran will ever again face the humiliation that Walter Freeman endured. The president said, as Walter looked on wearing his Purple Heart with quiet pride. "It reminds us that respect for service is not optional, it's a fundamental obligation of a grateful nation." Walter had become an unlikely national figure, speaking at veterans events, military academies, and law schools about the importance of dignity and respect in the justice system. He'd written a book about his experience with proceeds going to veterans' legal aid organizations. Judge Barrett's fall from grace had been complete. Disbarred and facing federal civil rights charges, he'd become a cautionary tale about the abuse of judicial power. Several other judges had been investigated and disciplined based on complaints that emerged in the wake of Walter's case. The courthouse, where it all began, now displayed a plaque in the lobby in honor of all veterans who have served with distinction and deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. The plaque was installed on the first annual Freeman Day declared by the county to commemorate the importance of standing up for principle. Walter's grandson, Marcus, had been accepted to law school, inspired by his grandfather's fight for justice. "I want to make sure that what happened to Grandpa never happens to anyone else," Marcus said during his application interview. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the simplest one: Walter could now wear his Purple Heart anywhere without fear of being asked to remove it. The medal that had once been called a trinket was now protected by federal law as a symbol of service and sacrifice. On quiet evenings, Walter would sit on his porch and look at the medal that had changed his life and the lives of countless other veterans. He thought about Margaret, who would have been proud of his stand, and about the soldiers he'd served with in Vietnam, many of whom had lived to see justice finally served. Walter Freeman had proven that one person's courage to stand up for what's right could change the world. One courtroom, one law, one act of respect at a time.